At night from space, you can see which countries have power. Europe is a blaze of light. The eastern United States glows like a circuit board. Even parts of Southeast Asia and South America burn bright. Then you look at Africa, and the place where Nigeria sits, a country of over 220 million people, the largest economy on the continent, one of the top 10 oil producers in the world. There is almost nothing. Darkness. Not the darkness of an empty place, the darkness of a full place that have been filled. Nigeria has roughly 90 million people with no access to electricity at all. That is the largest of such number of any country on earth. For the tens of millions technically connected to the grid, connection means very little. Power comes for 2 hours, or 4, or not at all. The voltage is so low that it cannot charge a phone. Surges are so unpredictable that they sometimes destroy appliances. This is not a poor country's problem. Nigeria earns billions from oil. It sits above one of the largest natural gas reserves on the continent. It has rivers powerful enough to generate hydroelectric power for generations. It has sunshine that could power solar farms across the entire northern region. Nigeria has everything it needs to keep the lights on, and yet darkness. In January of 2026, the Nigerian government announced a 501 billion naira bond, roughly $2.9 billion, which was aimed at rescuing the power sector. Officials called it a turning point, a reset. Investors subscribed in full. But Nigerians have heard this before. 1999, 2005, 2013, 2017, 2020, 2023. Every few years, a new plan, a new bond, a new reset, and yet Nigeria is still dark. The question is not whether Nigeria has money, gas, ambition, or sunlight. The question is structural. Why does every intervention land on the same broken foundation? Chapter 1. Colonial wiring and what it left behind. To understand why Nigeria is dark today, you have to go back to the very first light. The first electric power in Nigeria did not arrive for Nigerians. It arrived for the colonial project. In 1896, the colonial administration established the first electricity supply in Lagos. It was built to power the machinery of extraction, ports, government offices, quarters where colonial administrators lived, the railways that carried goods out of the country. The very first architecture of electricity in Nigeria was designed as an enclave service. Power for the administrators, power for the exporters, everyone else was irrelevant to the design. Across British colonial Africa, electrification followed the same pattern. Cities before villages, export hubs before communities, government quarters before markets. Every choice about where to run a wire created precedents. That geography did not disappear when independence came. It became the foundation on which independent Nigeria tried to build a universal system. Crucially, colonial electrification was never run as a commercial service. There was no billing culture, no metering discipline, no expectation that electricity revenue would sustain electricity infrastructure. Power was an administrative instrument. It was not a market. That institutional DNA survived colonialism by decades. The Nigeria of 1960s and 1970s was a country of extraordinary ambition. The Kainji Dam was completed in 1968 and was a genuine engineering achievement designed to generate nearly 800 megawatts and signal Nigeria's arrival as a modern state. But it also established a pattern that would define the sector for 50 years. Nigeria became very good at building power infrastructure. It became far less good at maintaining it. Maintenance is unglamorous. There is no ribbon to cut when you service a transformer. In a country where political cycles are short and visibility is currency, maintenance loses to construction almost every time. Year after year, the Nigerian grid aged. The gap between installed capacity and actual available capacity quietly, steadily widened. Then came the deeper distortion. From the earliest years of independence, Nigerian government made a political choice. Electricity should be cheap, a social good, not a commercial transaction. This was not irrational. Nigeria was a young, poor country, but cheap electricity carried a hidden cost. When you price electricity below production cost, someone has to pay the difference. In Nigeria, that someone was most often the future, deferred maintenance, unpaid suppliers, accumulated debts. The National Electric Power Authority, NEPA, became one of the most notorious institutions in Nigerian public life. Nigerians gave it a different name, never expect power always. That joke is decades old, it is still being told today. The oil boom of the 1970s made structural reform easier to avoid. When oil money flooded government accounts, Nigeria had resources to transform its power sector completely. Instead, oil revenue reduced the pressure to build the institution that sustained development. Why reform a broken electricity tariff when you could subsidize the losses? Why discipline a state utility when political loyalty mattered more than performance? By the time oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, Nigeria had built hardware, dams, power stations, transmission lines, but not the software to sustain them. No commercial discipline, no metering culture, no enforcement capacity. The hardware was already aging and there was no institutional muscle to maintain it. The reform era and its limits. When democracy returned in 1999, electricity was top of the agenda. Every government that followed promised transformation. The National Integrated Power Project was launched in 2004 with billions of dollars. In 2013, the sector was onboarded. 6 generation companies created, 11 distribution companies sold to private investors, the transmission company of Nigeria placed under management contract. The logic was sound. Private operators would bring capital, efficiency, and commercial discipline. They will meter customers, reduce losses, improve collections, and reinvest in the network. But privatization delivered private ownership into a broken system without fixing the system first. The discos inherited decaying networks, unmetered customers conditioned not to pay, tariffs set below cost of service, and government promises of subsidy compensation that frequently arrived late or not at all. This was a lesson. You cannot privatize your way out of a structural problem. Private ownership only works when the underlying economics are viable, but Nigeria's were not. The reform era produced real but insufficient gains. Some generation capacity was added, some regulatory frameworks were strengthened, but the core failures persisted and in some cases deepened because the private discos lacked both the capital and the political mandate to enforce what the old state utility could not. To understand why, you need to look at the specific named problems that sit at the heart of Nigeria's darkness, not vague references to inefficiencies, actual structural failures, named, explained, and taken serious. The problems that keep Nigeria dark. Nigeria's electricity crisis is not one problem. It is a lot of interlocking failures, each feeding the other. Remove any one of them and the system improves. But until all are addressed together, every intervention, bond, plant, or even reform lands on the same broken foundation. Problem 1, transmission constraints and grid fragility. Transmission is the invisible middle of the electricity chain, and it is Nigeria's most underreported failure. The Transmission Company of Nigeria, TCN, NERC's own data shows billing efficiency at 78.45%, meaning more than 1 in 5 of electricity delivered is never even invoiced. Estimated billing also creates a second darker problem. It creates space for manipulation. Disco feed staff who control estimated billing have discretion over what a customer owes. That discretion becomes leverage for corruption, for politically motivated undercharging of powerful customers, and for overcharging of vulnerable ones who lack the knowledge or connections to dispute. Every unmetered customer is a leak in the revenue system, and in Nigeria, the leaks are so numerous and so large that the system bleeds continuously regardless of how much electricity is generated. Problem 3. A tariff-subsidy-debt loop. For most of Nigeria's post-independent history, electricity tariffs have been set below the actual cost of producing and delivering electricity. This was a political choice. Electricity was seen as social entitlement and not a commercial service. The arithmetic consequences are inescapable. When revenue cannot cover costs, someone must bridge that gap. In Nigeria, that bridge has been built from 3 materials: government subsidies, supplier arrears, and debt. And each of these materials has its own corrosive properties. Government subsidies, when they arrive, provide temporary relief, but they create dependency. When they are delayed, which is frequent, the sector freezes. Generation companies that are owed money stop supplying at full capacity. Gas suppliers that are not paid reduce deliveries, and the system contracts. The tariff-subsidy-debt loop works like this. Tariffs are set too low, discos undercollect, gencos are unpaid, gas suppliers are unpaid, generation falls, outages worsen, customers resist paying even the low tariff, discos collect even less, and the loop tightens with every cycle. The April 2024 Band 8 tariff reform acknowledged this reality for the first time at scale, increasing tariffs for customers receiving 20 or more hours of supply per day. But band segmentation without enforcement is arithmetic rearrangement and not structural repair. Customers below Band A still receive subsidized power. The system cannot afford to provide it. The loop continues, just more slowly for the top tier. What makes this loop particularly resistant to reform is that every attempt to raise tariffs is experienced by ordinary Nigerians as an attack on their living standards because they receive unreliable service. They have no basis for trusting that higher payments will provide better outcomes. This is rational, and it is a trap. Problem 4. Gas payment chain breakdown. Nigeria has the 9th largest natural reserves in the world. It is genuinely paradoxical that a country sitting on this resource base cannot keep its gas-fired power plants running at capacity. The paradox resolves when you follow the money, or rather, follow its absence. Gas suppliers are commercial entities. They produce gas and expect payment. But payment for gas depends on electricity being sold and revenue being collected downstream. When discos undercollect, they cannot remit fully to generation companies. And when generation companies are not paid, they cannot pay gas suppliers. And when gas suppliers are not paid, they reduce or redirect supply. Gas payment arrears in the Nigerian electricity sector have at various points exceeded hundreds of billions of naira. These are not accounting entries. They represent real gas that is not flowing and real turbines that are not spinning. Pipeline vandalism adds a physical layer to the financial one. Nigeria's gas transmission infrastructure runs through the Niger Delta, one of the most conflict-affected regions in Africa. Militant activity and community grievances over oil extraction have repeatedly resulted in pipeline attacks that cut gas supplies to power plants for weeks or months at a time. Even when pipelines are intact and gas is available, transport bottlenecks create constraints. Nigeria does not have a well-developed gas transportation network. Plants located away from major supply corridors face chronic supply shortfalls regardless of payment conditions. The result is a country that has the geological endowment to power its grid many times over, but cannot reliably convert that endowment into electricity because the financial and physical plumbing between the gas in the ground and the turbines in the plant is broken at multiple points simultaneously. Problem 5. Disco financial non-viability. Nigeria's 11 distribution companies are, by any honest financial assessment, not viable as currently structured. This is not just an accusation, it is real. In Q4 of 2023, Aggregate A, T, C, and C losses across the discos stood at 42%. That means for every 100 naira worth of electricity that entered Nigeria's distribution networks, 42 naira was never recovered as cash. Technical losses, which is the physics of electricity moving through wires, accounts for some of this, but commercial losses and collection failures account for far more. No infrastructure business survives 42% losses indefinitely. At that loss rate, a disco cannot service its debt, it cannot finance its network upgrades, it cannot install meters that would reduce the losses, and it will continue to destroy it, and it cannot even pay employees who would find and fix the fault. The discos are caught between costs they cannot control and revenue they cannot collect. The cost of bulk electricity they purchase from generation companies rises with gas prices, but currency and currency depreciation. The tariff they are permitted to charge customers is politically constrained. The gap between the two is the disco's structural deficit. Private investors who acquired discos in 2013 paid for assets they could not make profitable under the regulatory and political conditions they inherited. Many have since struggled to make the capital investment in their networks. The result is a distribution sector that is simultaneously privately owned and publicly dysfunctional, with the accountability of neither state nor market. Several discos are technically insolvent. They survive through a combination of deferred payments, government interventions, and the implicit understanding that no government can afford to let them collapse entirely. This is not a business model. It is just decay that is being managed. Problem 6. Political interference in regulation. Nigeria has a regulator, which is the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, NERC. It has the legal mandate to set tariffs, license operators, enforce standards, and discipline non-performance. On paper, it is the institutional backbone of a functioning electricity market. In practice, NERC's authority has been repeatedly compromised by political intervention. Tariff increases approved by NERC have been reversed or suspended by government order. Performance sanctions against discos have been diluted under political pressure. Regulatory timelines have been disrupted by ministerial interference. The result is a regulator that cannot credibly commit to the rules it sets, because everyone in the sector knows those rules can be overridden when they become politically inconvenient. An electricity sector where regulation is not credible is an electricity sector where no serious investor will make long-term commitments. Why build a power plant if the tariff that makes your investment viable can be cancelled by a press conference? This regulatory uncertainty creates a chilling effect on the entire investment pipeline. Independent power producers, IPPs, price political risk into their financing terms and making projects more expensive. International investors demand sovereign guarantees that governments are reluctant to provide. And domestic operators learn that relationships with decision-maker matter more than operational performance. Political interference in regulation is not a peripheral problem. It is the meta problem, the one that makes every other solution harder to implement because it undermines the institutional framework on which all solutions depend. What are the solutions to these problems? What follows are not recycled policy recommendations. They are not versions of things that Nigeria has attempted. These are specific structural intervention that targets the problems we have highlighted before now and have not to date been seriously implemented at scale. Again, the key here is not just policies, but implementation. The first solution, corporatize and recapitalize TCN properly. The Transmission Company of Nigeria has never been properly reformed. It sits in an institutional limbo, nominally state-owned, managed under a contract with insufficient accountability. It is undercapitalized and operating equipment that in some cases dates back to the 1970s. The solution is not another management contract. It is full corporatization, transforming TCN into an independently governed, commercially structured entity with a ring-fenced balance sheet, the legal authority to borrow against its assets, and a regulatory compact that allows it to recover transmission investment costs through a clearly defined wheeling charge. A corporatized TCN with access to capital markets, backed by a sovereign guarantee on its first issuance to establish its creditworthiness, could finance the transmission expansion Nigeria needs at a pace the current structure makes impossible. The target should be doubling wheeling capacity within 10 years through a combination of new high-voltage lines, substation upgrades, and grid digitalization. This has not been done before. Nigeria has had management contracts technical advisors, and world-backed lending to the TCN. It has not had genuine institutional transformation, and that is the gap. Solution 2, willing capacity expansion as national priority infrastructure. Separate from the institutional question of who runs TCN is the physical question of what gets built. Nigeria's transmission network needs a specific, costed, prioritized expansion program, not a general aspiration to improve transmission, but a named list of corridors, substations, and lines to be built in a defined sequence with defined financing, defined contractors, and defined completion dates. The most critical constraint is the north-south corridor. Nigeria's major hydroelectric generation is in the north and center. Its major load centers are in the south, Lagos, Port Harcourt, Ibadan. The transmission lines connecting generation to load are insufficient. They are aging and they have no redundant pathways. A single fault on a primary line triggers system-wide instability. Building redundant high-voltage corridors between Nigeria's generation centers and its major cities would do more for electricity reliability than any number of new power plants built behind a bottlenecked transmission network. This is infrastructure that can be financed through a combination of development finance, institutional lending, infrastructure bonds, and bilateral concessional financing, none of which requires the kind of commercial revenue certainty that makes DisCo investments difficult. Transmission is a natural monopoly with a defined asset base. It is exactly the kind of infrastructure that long-term patient capital can finance if the governance framework is credible. This is not just blanket government subsidy. It's credit enhancements that makes the payment chain bankable without requiring the government to take on unlimited fiscal liability. Several West African countries such as Ivory Coast, Senegal, Ghana at various points have used variants of this structure to develop its IPP markets. Nigeria has not at a meaningful scale. Solution 5. Embedded generation zones for industrial clusters. Nigeria's industrial and commercial sector spends an estimated $20 billion annually on self-generation. This is an economic tragedy. We supply electricity directly to all industrial and commercial customers within the zone at a cost-reflective tariff under a direct commercial contract. The embedded generator would be gas-fired, solar hybrid, or a combination depending on the zone's location and resource availability. Critically, it will bypass the semi-functional disco revenue chain entirely. Customers pay the generator directly. The generator recovers its costs. No estimated billing. No ATC and C losses on the distribution network. No government subsidy required. Industrial and commercial customers are Nigeria's highest value electricity consumers. Giving them reliable, dedicated power at a fair price removes the $20 billion self-generation burden and makes Nigerian manufacturing competitive and creates a replicable model for structured private electricity market outside the grid. This model exists in embryonic form through Nigeria's captive generation regime. What has not happened is its deliberate scale deployment as an industrial policy instrument. The legal framework exists. The gas supply in most industrial zones exists. What is missing is the deliberate government decision to designate zones, license operators, and enforce the model. Solution 6. Federal enforcement of DISCO performance benchmark. Nigeria's regulatory framework already contains performance benchmark for DISCOs, targets for ATC and C loss reduction, metering coverage, fault resolution times, and customer service standards. NERC publishes quarterly data that shows in granular detail which DISCOs are meeting these benchmarks and which are not. The problem is that non-compliance has historically had no serious consequence. DISCOs that miss targets receive warnings. Occasionally, they receive fines that are too small to influence behavior. Their licenses are not revoked, their management is not replaced, the feedback loop between poor performance and institutional consequence is broken. The solution is binding performance compacts between the federal government and each DISCO with escalating consequences for non-performance, beginning with mandatory operational oversight, progressing to management replacement, and culminating in license revocation and rebidding after a defined period of persistent failure. Crucially, the performance compact must also contain government commitments, timely subsidy payment, cost-reflective tariff approval, and non-interference in operational decisions. The compact is bilateral. Government has failed DISCOs as surely as DISCOs have failed customers. Acknowledging that and making it contractual is the foundation of a credible reform. Solution 7. Decentralized mini-grid licensing fast track. For the 90 million Nigerians without grid access, waiting for the national grid to reach them is not a plan, it's wishful thinking. In the sparse rural communities and peri-urban settlements far from existing infrastructure, the economics of grid extension are not favorable. The cost of transmission lines and distribution network to serve low-density, low-income communities cannot be recovered through electricity tariffs alone, and not in any politically acceptable price. Mini-grids, small, locally operated electricity systems that self-defined communities offer a different economics. A solar hybrid mini-grid serving 200 to 500 households can be built, financed, and operated by a private developer at a cost far below grid extension, with revenue models that can be made bankable if the regulatory framework is clear and stable. Nigeria has mini-grid policy and a mini-grid regulation. What it does not have is functioning fast-track licensing process. Application for mini-grid license takes months or years. Developers cannot finance projects without licenses. The pipeline of viable projects backs up behind a regulatory bottleneck that serves no one. The solution is a 30-day administrative licensing process for mini-grids below a defined capacity threshold, say 1 megawatt, with a standardized application, a standardized power purchase model for communities, and a defined process for what happens if and when national grid eventually reaches the community. The darkness Nigeria lives in is not inevitable. It is not geography. It is not poverty. It is not the absence of resources, ambition, or talent. It is the accumulated result of structural failures that have been allowed to compound for decades, each one addressable, none of them addressed with seriousness or consistency to break the loop. Transmission constraints that no one fixed because fixing them was invisible. Metering gap that no one closed because estimated billing served too many interests. A tariff loop that no one broke because raising prices politically costly. A gas payment chain that no one repaired because the arrears kept building up quietly. Distribution companies that no one held accountable because accountability would require confronting powerful people. A regulator whose decisions no one respected because the political system did not allow it. Every night that 90 million Nigerians go without electricity is a policy outcome. It is not an act of God. It is not a consequence of geography. It is a choice made and avoidable by people with the power to decide differently. The solutions that are described here are very possible, and they are not waiting to be invented. They're just waiting to be chosen by the right people. Corporatizing DTCN, building the North-South Power Transmission Corridor, mandating prepaid meter with legal teeth, sovereign backing the IPP payment chain, creating embedded generation zone for industry, enforcing disco benchmark with real consequences, fast-tracking mini-grid licenses at scale. None of them is glamorous and none of them involve a ribbon to cut. None of them will produce a headline by the day they are approved. They will produce results in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, the kind of results that compound quietly until one day from space, the satellite image changes. Nigeria has everything it needs to keep the lights on. The question, and the only question that ever mattered, is whether it would finally choose to.